What can be done to tackle the rising cost of food? Will the government's NHS plan really deliver more doctors and nurses? And should the House of Lords be scrapped? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, the Conservative MP Luke Evans, the Labour MP and former leadership contender Rebecca Long-Bailey, Kulveer Ranger, who worked with Boris Johnson at City Hall, and Philippa Whitford from the SNP. Today, supermarket bosses say they're not profiteering.
We have doubled down on our competitiveness, and genuinely, we are the most competitive we have ever been.
With food inflation running at nearly 20%, is it time to cap the cost of the weekly shop?
The House of Lords is indefensible. We want to abolish the House of Lords and replace it with an elected chamber.
That was 6 months ago, but are those plans now on the back burner? Ministers say they have a plan to get more people working in the NHS. But we'll talk to a doctor who's planning to swap Britain for Australia. And is the government's plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda too expensive? OK, let's talk about the government's plan to deport people to Rwanda if they enter the UK by unofficial means. Here's this morning's BBC headline. Cost to remove a migrant, £63,000 more than keeping them in the UK, it says. It refers to a new Home Office impact assessment, which estimates that removing a migrant to Rwanda would cost around £169,000. That's more than putting them through the current system, which costs about £106,000 per person, mainly for accommodation. That means that the new scheme could cost £63,000 more per person overall. So how is this a saving, Luke?
Well, you've got to remember this is part of a joined-up plan and to act as a deterrent, and the saving will come with the fact that it costs nothing to deter people. That's really, really important. Every single day we're spending about £6 to £7 million on housing asylum seekers in our system, and that's expected to go up to £30 million in 2026. So there is an opportunity cost to not doing anything here. We've got to try and find a solution to try and deal with one of these priorities. I
mean, the Home Office estimate says that this is predicated on 40% of illegal migrants being deterred. Yeah. So you've got to hit that 40% mark.
Well, absolutely, and it's part of a joined-up process to try and make sure that if you set foot in here illegally, remember we're dealing with illegal immigration here, supporting the French as well to make sure our border force is stronger, but also investing in the likes of France with a £500 million investment for detention facilities there to help support this plan, because there's 100 million people across the world who could move, and if only 1% of them came across the UK, that's 1 million people coming into our country. And we know our services are already under pressure, the likes of the NHS, housing, education. So it's about being pragmatic. How can we stop this illegal immigration coming in?
Rebecca, is this policy too expensive?
Well, I think the figures show that the plan is unworkable, and when you put that alongside the government's illegal migration bill, you've got a plan put forward by government that's unworkable but also inhumane and quite clearly in breach of UN refugee conventions. Now, as Lucas said, the objective is to deter people from coming to the UK, but how will this actually deter people? Because refugees and asylum seekers are people fleeing horrific situations across the world. They're already willing to go in dinghies and boats across the Channel and in other parts of the world, knowing that their lives are at risk just to search for a better life. Now, what we need to have is a decent and comprehensive discussion about how broken our asylum system is, how underfunded it is, how we need to fund a cross-border policing unit, and how we actually have to have safe routes in place for asylum seekers so that they can apply from other countries without having to put their lives at risk by undertaking journeys on boats.
Kulveer.
It's an interesting conundrum. We've all been facing this about illegal immigration, and Luke's quite right about the costs here, but really trying to put a figure on this thing is very hard, because you can't put a figure on things like the pressure on health services, the pressure on housing that additional illegal immigration brings onto the country. And additionally, we look at the numbers, and the direct numbers, 2018, just under 300. Last year, almost 46,000 people coming in these small boats. And that rise is something we've got to address in a way that is humane, in a way that works to deter, in a way that doesn't degrade and supports the way we're trying to develop public services. I looked at the impact paper, and I looked at all the other examples it looks at as well, the challenges that the Australians faced from Indonesia, the issues around Morocco and Spain, Italy and Libya. And there's lots to be learned by how people have tackled this. And deterring has been the main lesson that has been learned. And I think that's where the government is looking at these examples that have succeeded, because if you look at the numbers, they do have an effect. And I think this is all part of a much larger plan to deter. And I think that's why we've got to look at it through that lens, rather than take a slice and go, does this figure add to a value?
So you think in the long term this could save money, even though on the surface it's more expensive?
Yes, I think because we're taking a slice of something that's a much bigger policy around deterring this kind of illegal immigration.
Philippa.
Well, asylum seekers and refugees are not illegal to start with. They arrive here by irregular means. But under the UN Convention, European Convention of Human Rights, it is not illegal. And Luke talks about the housing costs. That's because people are waiting 5 years to get a decision on their asylum case. So I would agree with Rebecca about you need to invest in safe and legal routes. We're welcoming people from Ukraine. We've taken a handful of thousands from Afghanistan, despite promises to protect people who worked with the British Army. But if you're someone from sub-Saharan Africa and your father is a political opponent, or you're the wrong religion, or you're gay, there is no way for you to apply for asylum until your foot is on the beach. And therefore, we're driving people into small boats instead of offering safe and legal routes. So spend the money on safe and legal routes that people do before they move, and invest money in the Home Office. Sticking people on a barge for 5 years, and then actually 80% of them are found to be genuine refugees and asylum seekers. And the whole narrative, as if they're playing the game, and the loss of protection for people who are victims of modern slavery, I mean, I think that's a disgrace for the UK. And it leaves the UK literally as an outlier.
We do have to address the issue that it's an industry around illegal smuggling that we're trying to smash here.
If you create safe and legal routes,
and
the traffickers lose their business.
The question is, how many? That is the key question, fundamentally. How many people, what's the SNP's figure that they would say is the right number to have in?
Now, the UK takes far less than most other countries in Europe.
Well, I haven't seen the SNP or Labour come up with a figure, and this is what it comes down to.
Well, we're not setting a figure for the UK, but you'll see that we've taken way beyond our share of people from Syria, way beyond our share of people from the Ukraine, because Scotland welcomes people, and actually because of the loss of freedom of movement, we need more people in Scotland.
But this is the fundamental question that we're dealing with, because if there's 100 million people displaced across the UK, and even a small fraction...
100 million are coming to the UK?
No, not across the UK, but even a fraction of that 100 million across the world come to us. We've got to have the housing, the facilities. I've worked in Birmingham in some of the asylum GPs, seeing the cases that they've been through, the support that they need.
But don't trap them for 5 years in this housing.
I agree
Let them get to work.
Agreed.
They want to work. They want to feed their families. They want a better life.
Should they come illegally across the channel?
They're not illegal.
When we're already supporting the likes of the Afghans, the Syrians,
and asylum
the Ukrainians,
seekers.
Hong Kong, we've had huge numbers coming to the country.
But you're not welcoming anyone else. There's lots of reasons that make people become asylum seekers or refugees, and they have no route other than to get one of those
So what is
boats.
the number the SNP would have?
It's not about a number. You can fix this by safe and legal routes and sorting your Home Office.
How many safe and legal routes would you have?
OK.
You should have an open, safe and legal route. You make the argument of why you're a refugee, regardless of what country. Shouldn't just be country at a time.
We will definitely come back to this story, because I think we could continue for the next half an hour on this one, but we're not going to. We're going to talk about something that affects all of us now, food prices. The bosses of the big supermarkets, Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda and Morrison's, were grilled by MPs this morning on the Business and Trade Committee. Let's hear a little bit of that.
It's been described by Sharon Graham, the General Secretary of United Union, that the biggest supermarkets in the UK are engaged in, and I'll quote, grotesque display of profiteering at this time, at a time when millions of workers are struggling simply to put food on the table. What do you say to that?
We make, and this is the whole group, 4 pence in every pound, which I don't think is any example of profiteering. We really, without customers and without their trade, there is no Tesco. And we have doubled down on our competitiveness. And genuinely, as we've said recently in our quarterly update, we are the most competitive we have ever been.
OK, the bosses of the big supermarkets defending themselves in Parliament this morning. Overall, food prices have actually gone up by about 18% in the last year, but let's drill down into some of the individual products. We'll start with a 250-gram block of butter. That has increased by 36 pence in the last year. It now costs £2 and 32 pence. A pint of milk has increased by 16 pence. It now costs about 68p. Moving on to eggs, a dozen eggs have increased by 66 pence. It now costs £3.23 for a dozen eggs. And moving on to cheese, this is a shocking one. Cheddar cheese has risen by £3.11. It now costs £9.70 per kilogram. And carrots have increased by 17p, so it's now 73p a kilo. Huge concerns there for many people, Luke. What do you say to the people at home who have seen this huge inflation, this huge rise in their weekly shopping bills?
Well, of course, and this is what it really matters. We politicians talk about inflation when it's actually the cost of these products in day-to-day terms that really make a difference. I'm really pleased to see the government's got the CMA, so the Competition and Markets Authority, looking at both fuel prices and food prices, because what we really want to see is there profiteering going on? We've heard on the clip there that isn't the case, but that is the key part that we want to see. And it comes at 3 different areas. If you think about, we've got the suppliers, the retailers and the producers. Now, we've got a whole argument. I'm from a rural constituency that are our farmers getting the value for what they're producing? And actually, we import 44% of our food into the UK. So we're clearly vulnerable, a bit like energy security. Food security is a real issue too. So I'm pleased the CMA are looking at this, and this is the right way to make sure that actually the system is operating properly, because at the end of the day, it is costing more for people on their table.
That's an interesting point, because I think, particularly dairy farmers have complained for a long time that the supermarkets have kind of effectively controlled the prices. Let's look, though. I mean, previously, a few weeks back, if you look at the end of last month, we were hearing lots of stories being dripped out from government about there being a cap. I think we can see the Telegraph there, the Sunday Telegraph. Rishi Sunak will ask stores to cap basic food prices. But Number 10 has since kind of drawn back on that. What do you think about the idea of capping food prices?
It's a bad idea.
Why?
I think it has its place when, for example, after the war we did it, but it leads to rationing. I think there's a better way to say how can we encourage the market to sort things out, which is, if we take Sainsbury's, for example, yesterday came out and said they're going to cut the prices on their basics. That's a really important way to make sure that people get the support they need. Now, if the market isn't functioning properly, absolutely government should step in. But the way we do that is through the regulator and the likes of the CMA. And I think it's really important that we actually encourage the supermarkets to put their money where their mouth is and make those changes, which I hope the likes of Sainsbury's and I believe Morrison's are looking at doing the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who was trying to encourage the supermarkets into this idea of a voluntary
Well, that's
cap.
what we've done with the mortgages as well. Get the banks together, try and make a solution to try and help ease this, because it's tough for everyone.
Rebecca, do you agree with the Prime Minister?
I think we should be exploring price caps or price controls, and I think it's important to note that a number of European countries are already doing this, whether it's from voluntary agreements with supermarkets, which of course I would like to see, all the way through to fixed price caps or cutting VAT on food, because even the Bank of England has suggested that profiteering is occurring in some sectors on some products, and the IMF only yesterday stated that a lot of the inflation that we're seeing in Europe is largely down to corporate profiteering, so something needs to be done. And I think taking a short-term, targeted approach on specific products would provide a lot of security and reassurance to families who are really, really struggling at the moment.
What's the SNP position on this, Philippa?
Well, I think we would agree with having some kind, whether it's voluntary or whether it ends up having to be a statutory limitation. I think you've highlighted yourself, and we see it if we're in supermarkets ourselves, it's often actually the supermarket's own basics ranges that are going up the most. So, you know, we quote food inflation in the teens, but if you look at what someone on a low income is putting in their basket, it can be 30, 40, 50% increase for them. And that's really not justifiable. I mean, I would agree with Luke, you have to look at the whole chain. I'm also a rural community, and one of the things that the government are not doing is protecting domestic food security. So high-intensity farmers, dairy, egg-producing livestock who use a lot of energy, they're not covered by the high-intensive industry energy protection. Well, you should be doing that. You also have to look at the power of supermarkets or middlemen. But equally, both the government and Labour are in denial about the contribution of Brexit to this. We get 28% of our food from Europe. Food inflation in the UK is 50% higher than the European average. And some of that is the cost of food coming in, and is going to go up massively next winter when the UK finally introduces its full checks on foodstuffs and agri-produce coming in from Europe. So actually, we've another hit that's going to come in a matter of 6 months.
Colville, do you agree?
I don't agree there should be a cap on food prices. I don't think the government should be playing that.
Voluntary or otherwise?
Voluntary, yes, but this is what they're trying to do, I think, by bringing the supermarkets together to discuss what they can do. I think it's very dangerous for any government to get involved in a free market and to start to decide where do you draw the boundary lines? You know, what do you stop a price cap on? What do you affect the price cap on? So I think that's not on the table. But I think what we do want to consider, I think these supermarkets, I think the big four were there today giving evidence and many other are available. But I think the question is, what are they doing? Is it easy for the consumer, the customer, us, to understand what they're doing for us? I think transparency is really helpful here. They were saying today about the plethora of initiatives that they may be doing, but sometimes that can be lost in the noise, and it's very hard for us to decipher what's real value here, and what do they have to do and what they're doing to help us. But I think fundamentally, this is also business, and it's their brands. If they help their consumer and the customers now, people will trust them. Sainsbury's, Morrison's, Asda, you know, other supermarkets. This is a moment for them to step up, and people will remember this if they say, we're doing this to help you. I know some of them have given significant pay rises to their own employees to help them through the cost of living crisis, and they're doing things to help in food banks and various other areas. But make it clearer for the Joe public to understand what's going on. Yes, look at keeping the prices down, especially on the basics. That's absolutely a point. That's the place where it's really hitting people. They're looking at the basics, and sometimes those aren't available now. And they did say, I heard a little bit of the evidence that was being given, that they look at keeping prices in certain geographies depending on what's selling there. And they are very cleverly modelling this,
Rebecca,
so they can be better at targeting.
Do you agree with Philippa that Brexit is having an impact here?
I think Brexit is having an impact, and I think that's why it's important to note that the Labour Party's position is that we would secure trade deals with countries across the world to make our trading arrangements a lot easier. And I think I agree with the point that Philippa made earlier about supporting our domestic producers who are energy intensive, and that's why the Labour Party said that we're going to levy a windfall tax on big oil and gas producers to provide that support to those manufacturers and producers who are struggling at this time. And I think it's important to note that in any price capping scenario or voluntary agreement scenario, there has to be a mechanism built in that protects domestic producers who are genuinely facing difficult economic times. What we don't want to see are the supermarkets bringing prices down, but then pushing down the cost price on their domestic producers, because as we know, that's happened in the past with milk and with bakers, and we can't see that happen again.
Luke, you said that the regulator's looking into this, they're looking at this sort of thing. But, you know, ultimately, is that going to be enough? These are huge businesses which, when it comes down to it, they're thinking about their bottom line, they're thinking about their shareholders.
Well, absolutely, and it's all interwoven, isn't it? And this is part of the problem. So the CMA have to be the tough regulator. They're looking into fuel prices, for example. So we'll hear in July exactly what they've got to say. They did an initial quick review into it to see, is there a problem here, and said, we think there might be. So now let's have another look. Food is the next part. But, I mean, fundamentally, for anyone listening out there who's worried, the key thing is there is support out there for you. The likes of the Household Support Fund is in its 4th iteration. You can get access to extra funding to try and help you with those difficult payments, the food vouchers. This is really important to make sure that people sat at home, you know, approach your MP, approach your council, ask citizens' advice. There is help out there for you if you need it, and that's the key thing.
Yeah, There are a huge number of families struggling at the moment. One of the ways that's been suggested to potentially help some of those families is the introduction of universal free school meals for children. I think we can have a look at the eye now. It says here, Labour MPs intensely lobbying Keir Starmer to commit to universal free school meals. Rebecca, are you one of those who are intensely lobbying your leader?
I am, and I think there's a moral and an economic argument here. So we know that 4 million children are experiencing food insecurity. And that means that when they're at school, they're unable to learn, they're unable to achieve or reach their full potential, because how can you reach your full potential if you're hungry all the time? But the knock-on effect of that is that means when we have children who don't achieve their aspirations, that knocks onto our economy detrimentally, because we don't fill the skills gap that we currently face and we don't grow our economy overall. So I think there was an interesting bit of economic analysis done by PricewaterhouseCoopers that showed that for every £1 invested in free school meals, we'd actually see a wider economic benefit of £1.71, and that runs into the billions.
Well, that's the argument for. If we look at the Times, though, it looks as though the Labour leader isn't necessarily agreeing with you. It says here that Labour rules out free school meals for all children. So are you you're throwing all that information on deaf ears? That the Labour leader's not.
I mean, we've not set out our manifesto yet, and I completely understand that we're going to be coming into government in a really difficult economic period. But ultimately, if our goal is to grow the economy, we have to ensure that children have the means to be able to reach their potential, and to do that, they have to have full bellies.
Broadly speaking, I suppose, we mentioned at the top, didn't we? You ran against Keir Starmer, and at the time, on paper, you wouldn't have said that you two were in a particularly different place. How do you feel broadly about the direction of the party at the moment? Are you guys still on the same page?
Well, on many issues we are, and we want to see a Labour government. And ultimately, as I say, instances such as the free school meals debate are important, because as a party, we're a democratic party, and our leadership should listen to its membership and its MPs. And hopefully, as a group collectively, we can formulate the best policies for the country going forward.
I mean, as you said, the next manifesto has not been written yet, but are you a little disappointed about some of the pledges that were made at the time being dropped by Keir Starmer?
Well, I mean, we've got a different viewpoint and different objectives, and I understand that the economic climate that we're in has changed, but I wouldn't alter my view that in order to grow the economy, we have to invest, and we can't be frightened about doing that, investing in infrastructure, in a Green New Deal, because that will create jobs and prosperity in the long term. So I'd like to see us commit more to that over the coming months when we come up to a manifesto, as well as making sure that throughout this cost of living crisis, we're not frightened of not just providing the support that people need now, but tackling the flaws that we have in our current economic system, from the corporate governance and the way that companies are run, all the way through to taxation, and whether we have a fair taxation system, and we don't at the moment,
We also
unfortunately.
need to look at the cost of doing nothing. I mean, Michael Marmot's paper on the loss of height of 5-year-olds in the UK over the last 13 years of austerity should be something that really worries people, that they are so malnourished that they are dropping down the league of height. And, we talk a lot about closing the attainment gap. In Scotland, we've already got universal free school meals up to P5. We'll be rolling that out to P7 in the near future. We aspire to bringing that to secondary school.
Is there a date for that yet? Because that hasn't quite been clarified, has it?
Well, a lot of it is about kind of expanding school kitchens. And after COVID, there were real issues about construction materials. We had challenges when we doubled our free nursery places, so some of it is around that, but I mean, we're trying to do it as quickly as we can. But we need to realise that, exactly as Rebecca is saying, if you don't invest in children when they're little and give them the best life opportunities, you'll spend an absolute fortune picking up the pieces later, whether that's in poor educational outcomes, poor job outcomes, or in the justice system.
OK, all right, we're going to leave that there and move on now and talk about something completely different, Lords reform, although I suppose it is still Labour policy. Back in November last year, Sir Keir Starmer pledged to abolish the House of Lords to restore trust in politics. He now, though, appears to be somewhat going back on that pledge. Let's have a look at the Eye headline here that says Labour plans to abolish House of Lords the plan to abolish the House of Lords would take a back seat as we fix the country. That's according to the Labour MP Thangam Debonair. So what's going on, Rebecca? Are you abolishing the House of Lords? Is it?
Well, I hope so. According to the notes that I got through last night, we are. So that's good.
But maybe not. But maybe not just
in
yet.
my lifetime.
Not just-
But I think, well, I mean, it's understandable that we're going to have a lot to concentrate on when we're in government, and tackling the cost of living crisis is going to be our top priority. But we need to set in place a roadmap towards the abolition of the House of Lords, because it's absolutely preposterous that we have a second chamber in this country that's unelected, with people in it that can stay there for life. That's not to say that we don't have some brilliant lords, by the way, who have great expertise, because we do, but they should be elected and accountable to the people of this country. So what I'd like to see, certainly from our party over the coming months, is a bit of a roadmap towards the abolition and replacement of the House of Lords with an elected chamber.
OK, Luke, what's wrong with that?
Oh, no, it's a good pitch to be one of Keir's Lords when it next comes round, I think. So, I mean, I have some sympathy. I think we could all agree that the hereditary peers, probably everyone on this panel agree, probably don't have a place in the future. But on the one hand, we've got the position that we want to get rid of the House of Lords from the Labour Party. On the other hand, Keir said he needs 90 more Lords to be able to do his legislation. That just doesn't tally up. Which is it? Is it the principle that you don't like it, or you need your legislation to get through? We already have the Salisbury Convention there, which means that if, for those watching, if you put it in your manifesto, the Lords won't step in the way. We can put a manifesto there from the Labour Party if they win the general election and make that commitment. You know, since Keir's been in place, he's put 19 Lords in himself already. So we've got that thought going on at the same time. So I don't know which of the two it is, but I think there is open for reform. The question is, what does it look like? If you look across to the US, where everything is elected, you get a stalemate. So there is a worry there. And some of our Lords are fantastically good technocrats who look at detail of what's going on. We need that. That's a better advantage to our system, because they're there on their merit.
Philippa, I know that in theory the SNP would very much like to get rid of the House of Lords. Well, not even, well, you know, but in practical terms, given the state of the economy, should it be a priority?
Well, in practical terms, we're the only party who doesn't support the House of Lords, who don't ever take seats in the House of Lords. So, you know, our money is where our mouth is. There are ways you can have a second chamber. It's not that don't believe in having a second chamber. And you can have that they serve for a different length of term, so that it's staggered against perhaps 2 elections, so that you keep expertise. But people always defend, oh, you know, we've got great experts like Lord Winston. But the people who are there on the basis of non-political expertise is a small fraction. And if Labour pack with another 90, I mean, frankly, the size of the House of Lords is getting ridiculous. And the excuse, oh, we need to put more people in the Lords to help abolish it. No, it's the House of Commons that will abolish the House of Lords. So you don't need to pack up the House of Lords.
They've been trying for 100 years.
130.
Let's just have a look now.
Scepticism.
Speaking of packing the House of Lords, we can see now from the Independent a headline that says Tony Blair and Gordon Brown could be made Lords by Keir Starmer to bolster a Labour government. What do you think of that idea, Rebecca?
Well, I think it's up to Keir, isn't it? I think there are things that I agree with Gordon Brown and Tony Blair on, and there are certain things I definitely disagree with them on.
OK, all right. That's a very diplomatic answer. Well, speaking of the House of Lords, I have someone sitting next to me who's heading there very shortly. Colville, how did it feel when you found out that you were going to be made a Lord?
It was a genuine shock. I was sitting at the Oval watching some cricket, which just happened to get a call.
That sort of feels appropriate.
Well, yeah. Well, it was a day off. But look, it's a huge privilege. It's an honour. It's something that personally I share with everyone I've worked with in my career over the last 25 years. The times I've spent in industry, in politics, but also with my community. So yeah, it's something that's still sinking in, I would say.
Right, and so presumably, thinking of turkeys voting for Christmas, you'd be against the idea of getting rid of the House of Lords.
Well, I think there's always a question of reform, and that every institution should be looked at in terms of where it currently stands, when it was established, what is it trying to achieve, is it fit for purpose, and all of those things. I'd be very welcome. Well, I'd welcome that debate to see, you know, what we can do. But I'm still learning. I'll see what the value is. I think the House of Lords, though, and not just because I'm gay, I've probably always had this view, gets quite a bad rap because within Westminster there's really an acknowledgement of the amount of work that the House of Lords does. Quite a number of learned people in there, a mixture, a blend of world-class expertise with a bit of politics. Because if you make it wholly elected, then it becomes purely political. So there's a question around that. And the amount of legislative work and review, sometimes always contrary to what the government of the day is trying to achieve. It acts as a real handbrake on certain things. So I think that's understood very much in the Westminster Village.
Whether that's at the moment.
Yeah, whether that's understood outside, and maybe there's a bit of work to be done about getting more transparency, understanding of the House of Lords, the way it works and what it does, may help in part of those thinking.
Can I just ask you, given the controversy that has been around Boris Johnson's, nominations for the House of Lords, is that difficult for you, someone who's worked very hard, you've been given this honour, being associated with some of the other people who have been sent to the House of Lords? Sean Bailey's been accused of attending an illegal lockdown party. He's apologised. But, some of the other suggest... Is it difficult to be associated with that group? Does it take the shine off it?
No, not for me. As I said, I'm personally, I share this with all the people that I've worked with. In Sean's case, he's a dear friend. I've known him for over 20 years. The amount of work Sean has done with young people, young black people in his community and around London, and helped their lives. I don't think, the incident with the party, and he's apologised for that, should overshadow his life's work in terms of helping people. And that's what I mean. There's a vast amount of people in the House of Lords that have done amazing work. Some people might point at and say, we're not happy with that person. So I'm sure there'll be others in the House of Lords that might say that about me. But I think you get a mixture of society, a mixture of expertise and a mixture of backgrounds that maybe you don't get in any other institution and walk of life. And when you add politics to it, in an election, that would really change that, and we'd have to be careful to see how good we can
the situation.
Design it like that, in that you may have a certain amount that are openly elected geographically, but equally you could look at the sectors of society and say, you get so many lords, you get so many, you get so many, to make sure you are bringing medics and professors and academics and business people in.
Okay.
Because you don't want it. What it still is predominantly now is a retirement home for politicians.
Well, I hope that's not going to be my retirement. I have to be
it's a little bit young
active.
to retire. I just want to bring in another story here, actually. This is about Daniel Gorski. It's a little bit separate to what we've been talking about. I think we have the headline from the BBC News website. Daniel Gorski, Daisy Goodwin accuses mayoral hopeful of groping. This is an article that appeared in The Times. TV producer Daisy Goodwin making accusations about the Conservative London mayoral candidate Daniel Gorski. I should say that he has denied those allegations in the strongest possible terms and has said there was never any inappropriate behaviour whatsoever. Can I just ask you what you think the party should do? What should happen? Your reaction to that story?
To me?
Yes, Lee.
Elizabeth, I think, look, I don't know the details of this, and it'd be wrong for me to comment on it. I think most of the panel will say that. What I hope is, though, and what should come out of this, is that she has the ability to come forward, put those accusations forward, have them investigated swiftly, and if there is a case to be answered for, a defence to come forward and a justice to be served. And I think, regardless of political party, that's where we need to be, that people feel they have the confidence in the system to come forward and speak about problems, and that the justice to work swiftly if there is found wanting, but also the protections for those who are accused to make sure that there isn't false accusations going in place. That is a system I think everyone in the House, when I've been in there, debated. That's not party political. That's an ambition that we all share, that you should have the chance to be able to speak out and raise your concern. OK, well, we have had a statement through from the Conservative Party, which I can read to you. It says that the party has an established code of conduct and formal processes where complaints can be made in confidence. The party considers all complaints made under the code of conduct, but does not conduct investigations where the party would not be considered to have been the primary jurisdiction over another authority. Colville, what's your reaction to this story?
Well, I agree with what Luke said. I think, we have to look at it if there is this accusation and this lady is making, the issue here, then we have to look at, will there be an investigation? Who should actually make that investigation, which I think is what the Conservative Party is highlighting here. Where is the jurisdiction? Is she willing to go to the police, take the matter forward legally? I think at present she said she's not going to do that. So
you'd, in the current circumstances, you'd still back him to be the Conservative candidate?
Well, I think he will have to put his defence forward anyway, because I think the issue here now is we get judgment by the court of public opinion, and that's what's happening right now, isn't it? The story is running. His candidature is obviously being affected by this, and it will affect him going forward. So unfortunately, we have a situation where he now has to come out and say something in terms of, and he's denying it. I think it's sort of a loggerheads, because we have to find a route through this that says who actually takes this forward in a formal way. And that would only be done if the journalist says she's going to make some a legal case or go to the police with this accusation.
Philippa, you're nodding.
Well, I mean, there has to be a method of investigation. You know, obviously, we have a complaint system in the House Commons now that members of staff or others can complain about an MP, complain about another member of staff, and it's thoroughly investigated and a judgment and a penalty announced, even if it's below the level that you might go to the police with. And I think the problem is they need to agree who is going to investigate this, because either for her to give her justice in him, you know, apologising, maybe stepping back from what he's doing, but equally also for him. It can't just be that you throw an accusation at someone and then it's game over.
And then that's it. OK, all right, thanks all. We're going to move on and talk about the NHS now, specifically staffing levels. Let's take a look at this headline from the Nursing Times this week. NHS workforce plan coming this week, Sunak promises. Yes, this is the long-awaited NHS workforce plan, we have a little bit of breaking news for you this lunchtime as well. It's the Royal College of Nursing has announced that its strike action in England will not continue because not enough of its members took part in the ballot. A large majority were in favour of continuing strike action, but only 43% of its members took part in the poll, and therefore it didn't meet the 50% threshold. But we do have another strike of junior doctors coming up next month on the 13th of July, and doctors, of course, still after that 35% increase. We can speak to a doctor now. We can speak to Laura Rogolaski, a doctor who trained in the UK and spent a couple of years working in Australia, and I understand you're planning to head back there, Laura. So just talk to me about conditions in the NHS at the moment, and what is it that is making you want to go back to Australia?
Goodness. Well, hello. So my working as a doctor, I actually think is fairly similar in hospital in the UK compared to in Australia. I found my job quite similar. I think the difference was my standard hours were a 76-hour fortnight, whereas here I'm looking at 40, 50-hour weeks, usually as standard. The pay was obviously very different. So my pay is half now what it was in Australia. But when you're asking why would someone move to the other side of the world, of course, it's a lot more complex than that. So I've got two small children, a 1-year-old and a 5-year-old. And in 2020, when we left the first time, there were issues we had about the direction the UK had been heading in for quite a long time, and concerns we had about our future and our children's future. And we came back mainly because of the pandemic. Unfortunately, we were there for the whole of 2020 and the whole of 2021. My son was born out there. And we didn't see our family for 2 years. We didn't have residency. So at that point, we came back and I thought, well, I'll do my training and then we'll see where we are. Since we've been back, we've been kind of astounded at how expensive it is to live here. And the cost of living is a big factor as well as what I think is underinvestment in healthcare and education really for decades.
But Laura, you mentioned the pay. You said it's double almost in Australia.
And it was double.
It was double. And in terms of conditions as a doctor, because this is something we hear from GPs and from hospital doctors as well, that just because of understaffing levels, the working conditions are incredibly hard. Is it easier in Australia?
I think it's hard. So I was working as an obs and gynae registrar when I was in Australia. Now I've come back, I've decided to train as a GP. So I'm now doing GP training. At the moment, I'm working in the emergency department. And the emergency department, there's a lot of staff. Often we have gaps in the rota, but you just, as soon as you finish with one patient, you just see the next patient. And I guess with A&E, it's just how long people have been waiting for that you're sort of judging how busy you are like that. I find...
Laura, if you don't mind holding on there, because we happen to have two doctors on the panel, one of whom I know at least is very keen to persuade you to stay. I mean, Luke, what would you say to someone like Laura who's just saying, I get paid more, the hours are better, it's better for my family? How would you persuade her to stay in the UK?
Well, it's one of the driving forces, so no one in my family is political, they're all medical. And the reason I'm sat in this seat today is because as a junior doctor, I used to ask the question, well, why do we do this? and why does it happen like this, and be told, well, you're too junior and this is the way we've always done it. Two of the worst answers you ever hear. But in answer to that, one of the key things I've been arguing for in the Health Select Committee, where we spent 3 years, was how do we make the working life better? What is it that we can do? And I wouldn't be surprised if 10 to 15% of the workload is dealing with admin or terrible computer systems and things like that. Actually, what you want to do is try and improve that part, because that's good for patients and that's good for staff and staff morale. I'm pleased the government is starting to listen on things like changing the pension reforms. That's made an instant difference to senior doctors. But actually, it's the working conditions. In our report on the Health Select Committee, we said you could do quite a lot here about making sure that hospitals join up with GPs. That makes the working life enjoyable, because the medicine is the same whether you're in Australia or here. The key part is the system around it.
We don't have long, so I want to bring you back in, Laura. I mean, do you find any of that convincing? Could those other things help persuade you to stay, aside from the money?
I think, yes, of course, if the system works better, that makes your job easier. But what I'll just say back to Luke and to everyone is it's not about money. I love my job. I want to be a good doctor. And when I'm trying to see patients in 10 minutes and having to see 40 patients in a morning, this is as a GP I'm talking about, how am I performing good medicine? Whereas my new job, which I'm going to in January to start as a GP trainee in Australia, I will be seeing max of 30 patients a day. And I know I can be a better doctor and give my patients a better service because I'm not having to see so many. And that's a big part of job satisfaction for me as well, to be a good doctor.
I said we had another doctor here, Philippa. Why did you decide to move into politics, out of medicine?
Well, that came out of the Scottish referendum. But I didn't do it because I hated my job. I mean, I was a breast cancer surgeon for over 30 years, a general and trauma surgeon for 20 of that. I mean, I would echo some of what Luke says. And, you know, we'll wait and see what the plan is. I worry it may be all focused on recruitment, you know, more medical students, etc., whatever. Then we struggle to make sure we get hospital placements for them and struggle to make sure we get the junior hospital jobs for them. And then we don't create enough training places for them. But you also need to look at retention. I mean, Luke highlighted how the pension changes in 2015. The lifetime allowance caused senior GPs and consultants to retire in their late 50s, and the annual allowance drove younger consultants to go part-time and eventually some of them just to leave. So actually retention of the skills, and that involves looking at the entire lifetime of doctors. But junior doctors, the worse the workforce crisis gets, the more miserable every single day is, and therefore actually eventually people.
And Philippa, is it any better? I mean, would you be encouraging Laura to come to Scotland instead of doing her doctoring in England?
Well, we have the same workforce challenge, but junior doctors and nurses are paid more in Scotland, and you know, that's a reason why we've got, in things like cancer weights and A&E weights, we've got better performance. But there's no question that the pandemic knocked the stuffing out of all 4 NHSs. And what wasn't talked about in the media last winter is we had a COVID surge before Christmas, but actually we had an influenza outbreak that was twice the 17-18 outbreak that actually caused the NHS to struggle.
Yeah.
So we need to look at pay, junior doctors and nurses, but also working conditions, rotas, facilities, food in.
OK, we're fast running out of time, so I just want to give a quick word to Rebecca. What would Labour do to encourage Laura to stay?
Well, I think it's absurd that we're seeing a workforce plan from the government when they've been in power for 13 years, dramatically underfunded our NHS, driven it off a cliff, to the point where doctors, nurses, ambulance workers are so underpaid, overworked and stressed that they feel they have no option but to go on strike. They need to get real, fund the NHS properly and give the pay rises these workers deserve.
OK, Colville, 10 seconds.
I think it's a bit disingenuous about underfunding. The NHS is being funded. The challenge is, how do you get the model right, which is, as Philip is saying. There's a lot of challenges in the NHS. We can all see them. I know Labour are looking at reform of the NHS, and I think this government will try to build the hospitals and deliver the services that people need.
Breathe. OK, and that's all we have time for today. A big thank you to all of my guests. Come back and join me tomorrow at 11:15 for more Politics Live. Bye-bye.